March 19, 1945 dawned cold and clear over Ramitelli Airfield in southern Italy, where Captain Joseph Brodsky of the 5th Air Force paced nervously beside his B-17 bomber. He had heard the rumors circulating through the mess halls and briefing rooms, whispered conversations that spoke of a peculiar fighter squadron whose pilots never abandoned their charges, no matter how fierce the enemy resistance. These aviators painted their aircraft tails bright red, and the Luftwaffe had begun calling them Schwarzvogelmenschen, black birdmen, a designation that carried equal parts fear and grudging respect. What made German fighter pilots, veterans of the Eastern and Western fronts, fear these particular American escorts? The answer lay not in superior technology or numbers, but in something far more dangerous. An unshakable commitment to mission completion born from years of fighting prejudice as fiercely as they fought the enemy. The Tuskegee Airmen emerged from an experiment that many hoped would fail. When the War Department established the 99th Pursuit Squadron in March 1941 at Tuskegee, Army Airfield in Alabama, skeptics within the military establishment confidently predicted disaster. The prevailing belief, codified in official Army War College reports, insisted that Negro pilots lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes necessary for aerial combat. These men would prove such assessments catastrophically wrong. Captain Lee Archer, who would later become one of the war's first black aces, remembered his early training days with crystalline clarity. The cadets at Tuskegee faced an impossible standard. They had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Their instructors, including the legendary Chief Alfred Anderson and the exacting Captain Benjamin Davis, Jr., drove them relentlessly. Every mistake became ammunition for those who wanted the program terminated. Every success had to be extraordinary to gain even grudging acknowledgement. The journey from Tuskegee to the Mediterranean theater took these aviators through a gauntlet of institutional racism that would have broken lesser men. They trained in segregated facilities, ate in separate mess halls, and endured the daily humiliations of Jim Crow even as they prepared to defend a nation that denied them basic civil rights. Second Lieutenant Charles Dryden, navigating through the prejudice-soaked atmosphere of wartime Alabama, later wrote that every training flight felt like an act of defiance against those who believed black men belonged in service units, not cockpits. By April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron finally deployed to North Africa under the command of Colonel Davis, the son of the Army's first black general. Their P-40 Warhawks, though already obsolescent by European standards, became instruments of vindication in their capable hands. Initial missions over Pantelleria and Sicily demonstrated competence, but competence alone would not silence the critics waiting eagerly for failure. The real transformation began when the unit transitioned to bomber escort duty in the summer of 1944. The Army Air Forces faced a crisis. German fighter pilots were decimating bomber formations over strategic targets deep in enemy territory. Escort fighters frequently abandoned the lumbering bombers to chase German aircraft and rack up personal kill scores, leaving the bomb groups vulnerable to attack. The bomber crews, watching their assigned escorts vanish in pursuit of glory, began referring to themselves as sitting ducks during critical moments over the target. Then came the red tails, and everything changed in the blood-soaked skies over Europe. June 7, 1944 brought the 332nd Fighter Group, now equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts bearing distinctive red-painted tails, into sustained bomber escort operations over the Balkans and Central Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr. had instituted a revolutionary tactical doctrine that would fundamentally alter the calculus of aerial warfare: stick with the bombers, no matter what. This directive contradicted every instinct fighter pilots cultivated. The natural impulse when spotting enemy aircraft was to engage, to hunt, to pursue. Kills brought promotions, medals, and glory. Protecting slow-moving bombers while German fighters circled like wolves offered none of these rewards. It required suppressing the predatory instincts that made fighter pilots effective and embracing a defensive mindset that felt, to many aces in other units, like cowardice. The Tuskegee Airmen saw it differently. Captain Roscoe Brown, who would later shoot down one of Germany's revolutionary Me-262 jets, explained the psychology in post-war interviews. These pilots understood that every bomber they protected carried 10 men, whose lives depended entirely on the vigilance of their escorts. They had spent years fighting for the right to prove themselves in combat. They would not squander that opportunity chasing personal glory while the men they swore to protect died. German fighter commanders, reviewing intelligence reports and pilot debriefings throughout the summer of 1944, began noting a disturbing pattern. Major Günther Raoul, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 kills, later recalled the frustration of tangling with the Red Tail groups. According to documentation preserved in captured Luftwaffe records at the National Archives, German tactical bulletins specifically warned pilots about the red-tailed fighters who never leave their bombers, advising that attacks on bomber formations escorted by these aircraft required overwhelming numerical superiority or abandonment of the mission entirely. The transformation in bomber crew morale was immediate and measurable. Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, a ball turret gunner on a B-24 flying missions over Austrian oil refineries, described the profound psychological shift when red tails appeared on station. The bomber crews had grown accustomed to watching their escorts disappear over the horizon in pursuit of enemy fighters. The Tuskegee pilots remained visible throughout the mission, weaving protective patterns above and around the formations. This visible commitment provided comfort that translated directly into mission effectiveness. First Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester demonstrated this protective doctrine on July 18, 1944, during an escort mission to Memmingen, Germany. When German FW-19OS attacked his assigned bomber formation, Lester resisted the instinctive urge to pursue the diving attackers beyond visual range of his charges. Instead, he positioned his flight to intercept follow-up attacks, shooting down 3 enemy aircraft without ever losing sight of the bombers. His wingmen, Second Lieutenants Jack Holsclaw and Charles Bailey, destroyed 2 additional German fighters using the same tactics. The strategic implications became apparent in the statistics that accumulated through the summer and fall of 1944. While other fighter groups recorded impressive kill ratios and individual aces achieved celebrity status, the groups they escorted continued suffering devastating losses. The Tuskegee Airmen, conversely, compiled a different kind of record, bomber after bomber returning safely to base, their crews intact, their missions accomplished. This effectiveness came at a cost that official records only partially captured. The Red Tails absorbed tremendous battle damage staying with their charges. Pilots limped home in aircraft so badly shot up that ground crews wondered how they remained airborne. Second Lieutenant Robert Dease crashed on landing after an engagement over Vienna, his P-51 Mustang riddled with cannon fire sustained while protecting his formation from a determined German assault. He had refused to break formation despite having multiple opportunities to evade to safety. The psychological burden of this defensive stance weighed heavily on men trained to be aggressive hunters. Captain Edward Toppins, in letters home preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, described the internal conflict between wanting to pursue retreating German aircraft and maintaining station over the bombers. The discipline required to suppress predatory instincts in favor of protective duty demanded a maturity that many fighter pilots never developed. September 13, 1944 marked a pivotal moment when the 332nd Fighter Group, now flying P-51 Mustangs with their signature red tails and red nose markings, escorted a massive bomber formation targeting industrial facilities in Stuttgart. Major William Campbell, leading the fighter group that day, watched as over 200 German fighters rose to challenge the incursion, one of the war's largest aerial battles. The engagement that unfolded demonstrated precisely why Luftwaffe pilots had learned to fear the red tails, while German tactical doctrine emphasized breaking up bomber formations through aggressive head-on attacks, forcing the escorts to choose between protecting the formation or pursuing the attackers. The Tuskegee pilots refused to take the bait. They maintained their protective pattern even as German fighters flashed past, accepting hits from defensive bomber guns to remain in position. First Lieutenant Lee Hall, flying wing for Captain Brown, watched in Me-109 flash past barely 20 feet away, presenting a perfect deflection shot. His trigger finger tensed every hour of training screaming at him to fire. Instead, he held his position above the lead bomber element, knowing that breaking formation would create the gap German tactics sought to exploit. Seconds later, two more Me-109s appeared precisely where Hall would have been had he pursued the first target, seeking to exploit the opening his departure would have created. This tactical discipline infuriated German fighter commanders who had grown accustomed to escorts abandoning their charges. Oberst Johann Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, later described the Red Tails as impossible opponents because conventional tactics failed against pilots who refused to behave as fighter pilots traditionally did. His fighter wings had perfected the art of luring escorts away from bomber formations, but these particular Americans would not be lured. The bomber crews noticed. Staff Sergeant Harold Brown, a waist gunner on a B-17 named Memphis Belle II, wrote home in October 1944 describing his formation's red tail escorts, "They circle us like protective angels. Jerry fighters bounce us constantly, but those colored boys never leave their posts. We lost only 2 ships today when we might have lost 20 with different escorts. Every man on this crew would fly through hell itself with those red-tailed Mustangs guarding us." Such testimonials, though anecdotal, reflected measurable realities. Analysis of mission loss rates, compiled by 5th Air Force statisticians and now housed in Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, revealed a striking pattern. Bomber groups escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group suffered significantly fewer losses per mission than groups escorted by other fighter units, despite facing comparable enemy opposition. The statistical anomaly caught the attention of Lieutenant General I.R. Eaker, commander of Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. In confidential correspondence with General Henry Hop Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, Eaker noted that the Negro fighter group achieved results suggesting either exceptional skill or exceptional dedication, possibly both. He recommended expanding opportunities for Negro aviators throughout the service, a recommendation that faced fierce resistance from segregationist officers who attributed the success to statistical aberration rather than actual merit. Captain Wendell Pruitt and First Lieutenant Gwynn Pearson exemplified the Red Tail's effectiveness during a mission on October 12, 1944. While escorting bombers attacking the Blechhammer oil refinery in Silesia, they encountered Germany's revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter, an aircraft capable of speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, nearly 200 miles per hour faster than their Mustangs. Rather than attempting futile pursuit, they positioned themselves between the jet and the bombers, forcing the German pilot to attack through defensive fire. The Me-262 broke off, unwilling to accept the damage necessary to reach the bombers. This incident highlighted another dimension of the Red Tail's tactical approach. They fought smarter rather than harder when circumstances demanded. The pilots understood that protecting bombers did not require destroying every enemy fighter, merely preventing those fighters from completing attacks. Aggressive positioning, disciplined formation flying, and willingness to absorb battle damage created protective zones that German pilots found increasingly difficult to penetrate. January 27, 1945 brought one of the war's most demanding escort missions, a raid on Berlin itself. The symbolic and strategic heart of the Third Reich, the 5th Air Force committed every available bomber and escort fighter to this maximum effort, recognizing that the defenses protecting the German capital would be ferocious. Among the fighter groups assigned protective duty was the 332nd, whose red-tailed Mustangs would shepherd B-17s through 600 miles of hostile airspace. Captain Armour McDaniel, briefing his pilots before dawn, spoke plainly about the challenges ahead. The Luftwaffe, though battered by years of attrition, still protected Berlin with experienced pilots flying Germany's most advanced aircraft. The flak defenses around the city constituted perhaps the most concentrated anti-aircraft artillery in human history. Any bomber or fighter approaching the target area would face a steel curtain of exploding shells. Surviving the mission would require not just skill but also considerable luck. The Red Tails understood that their protective doctrine meant flying into that curtain alongside the bombers rather than remaining at safer altitudes, while other fighter groups positioned themselves above the flak envelope, ready to bounce German fighters but minimizing their own exposure to ground fire. The Tuskegee pilots maintained close formation with their charges, accepting the same risks the bomber crews faced. Second Lieutenant Charles Bailey, navigating through the dense flak over Berlin, felt his Mustang shudder as shell fragments tore through the wing. His instinct urged diving away from the danger, using the fighter's superior speed and maneuverability to escape the barrage. Instead, he held position just above the bomber formation, knowing that braking station might create an opening for German fighters waiting beyond the flak zone to pounce on stragglers. His aircraft absorbed additional hits, hydraulic fluid spraying across the canopy, but remained airborne and in position. The discipline this required cannot be overstated. Fighter pilots throughout the war consistently demonstrated exceptional personal courage in aerial combat, where death came in seconds of violent action. The Red Tails displayed a different kind of courage, the sustained bravery of remaining in harm's way minute after minute, hour after hour, while every instinct screamed to flee to safety. This was not the courage of momentary crisis, but the courage of endurance. First Lieutenant Roscoe Brown's encounter with a Me-262 near Berlin on March 24, 1945, demonstrated how this protective mindset translated into tactical success. Brown spotted the German jet preparing an attack run on the bomber formation. Rather than attempting the futile tactic of pursuing the faster aircraft from behind, Brown calculated the jet's attack vector and positioned his Mustang in the German pilot's path. The Me-262 pilot, confronted with a head-on engagement that would require flying through Brown's defensive fire to reach the bombers, broke off his attack. Brown pursued briefly as the jet climbed away, his guns scoring hits that would earn him credit for one of the war's rare Me-262 kills, but never lost sight of his assigned bomber element. This incident, widely reported in both military and civilian press, brought the Tuskegee Airmen to broader public attention. The Associated Press dispatch describing Brown's kill, circulated through American newspapers in early April 1945, noted that the pilot was a member of the famous Negro fighter group whose red-tailed aircraft have become the most requested escorts among bomber crews. This acknowledgement, though still filtered through the racial categories of the era, represented a significant shift in public perception. The bomber crews themselves had long since abandoned any racial prejudice in their assessment of the Red Tails. Technical Sergeant Michael Russo, a radio operator on a B-24, expressed the prevailing sentiment in his unit's informal newsletter: "We don't care what color they are. We care that they bring us home alive. The Red Tails do that better than anyone." This pragmatic meritocracy in the skies over Europe contrasted sharply with conditions on the ground. The Tuskegee pilots returned from harrowing combat missions to segregated facilities, separate officers' clubs, and constant reminders of their second-class status within the military they served with such distinction. Captain Lee Archer, after shooting down 4 German aircraft in a single mission, returned to base where he could not eat in the same dining facility as white officers with inferior combat records. February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day, brought the 332nd Fighter Group to one of the war's most controversial missions, the escort of bombers targeting Dresden, the historic Saxon city crowded with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet armies. The moral complexities of this raid, which would generate ethical debates lasting decades, were not apparent to the fighter pilots whose duty required simply protecting their assigned bombers regardless of the target. Captain Edward Gleed, leading the escort that day, focused on tactical realities rather than strategic questions. Intelligence reported that German fighter units had relocated to airfields around Dresden, anticipating Allied raids on the city. The Luftwaffe, though depleted by years of attrition, remained capable of mounting significant resistance when defending critical targets. Gleed positioned his fighters to intercept any German attempt to disrupt the bombing run. The mission proceeded with mechanical efficiency. German fighters rose to challenge the formation but found themselves unable to penetrate the Red Tails' defensive screen. The bombers released their loads and turned for home, their escorts maintaining protective station throughout the withdrawal phase when bombers were most vulnerable. Not a single bomber under red tail protection fell to enemy fighters during the Dresden mission, though the city below burned in a firestorm that would become one of the war's most debated events. This consistent protection generated measurable strategic value. By mid-March 1945, bomber groups specifically requested assignment of the 332nd Fighter Group as escorts whenever possible. Colonel William Terry, commanding a B-17 group, formally petitioned 15th Air Force Headquarters to assign Red Tail escorts to his unit's upcoming missions against oil refineries in Czechoslovakia. His written request, preserved in Air Force archives, noted that the Negro Fighter Group's protection has proven superior to other available escort units, resulting in markedly reduced bomber losses and improved mission effectiveness. Such requests created administrative complications in a segregated military. Official Army policy maintained racial separation in all units, yet operational necessity increasingly demanded assignment based on demonstrated capability. The tension between ideological segregation and practical merit became impossible to ignore as the war entered its final months. Major General Nathan Twining, commanding the 15th Air Force, confronted this contradiction directly. In March 1945, he issued orders assigning the 332nd Fighter Group as primary escorts for the Air Force's most critical missions, effectively acknowledging that the Negro pilots had become his most reliable fighter unit. This assignment, though never publicly framed as a repudiation of segregationist doctrine, functionally recognized merit over racial category in operational deployment. The German perspective on the Red Tails, documented in captured Luftwaffe records and post-war interviews with surviving pilots, reflected grudging respect tinged with racial confusion. Nazi ideology insisted on Aryan racial superiority and the inferiority of all other peoples, yet German fighter pilots found themselves consistently defeated by Negro aviators whose tactical discipline and flying skill exceeded that of many white American units. This cognitive dissonance appears in multiple Luftwaffe histories and pilot accounts. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who survived the war with 28 confirmed kills, later described encountering Red Tail escorts over Austria in March 1945. They flew like Prussian cavalry officers, with precision and discipline that would have honored the old Imperial Guard. We had been told these were primitive peoples incapable of such technical mastery. The propaganda proved worthless against their machine guns. First Lieutenant Charles Dryden shot down his fourth confirmed kill on March 31, 1945, during a massive escort mission protecting bombers attacking Linz, Austria. His victim was an experienced Luftwaffe pilot flying one of Germany's advanced FW-19OD fighters, a capable aircraft that should have enjoyed tactical parity with Dryden's Mustang. The engagement lasted less than a minute, with Dryden's superior positioning and marksmanship overwhelming his opponent before the German could effectively respond. The kill brought Dryden to the threshold of ace status, requiring just one more confirmed victory for that recognition. The psychological impact of the Red Tail's success extended beyond the bomber crews they protected. Negro ground personnel throughout the Mediterranean theater, serving in segregated support units under conditions often more degrading than those faced by combat personnel, drew inspiration from the Tuskegee pilots' achievements. Technical Sergeant William Johnson, a mechanic maintaining B-24 bombers, later recalled that news of Red Tail victories circulated through the Negro service units like electricity, providing tangible evidence that excellence could overcome prejudice even in an institution as segregated as the wartime Army. April 7, 1945 dawned overcast and threatening across northern Italy, where the 332nd Fighter Group prepared for another maximum effort escort mission. The target, oil storage facilities at Plitz, Germany, one of the last major fuel reserves available to German forces. The mission would require crossing the Alps, penetrating deep into German airspace, protecting the bombers through intense flak during the bombing run, and then shepherding them safely home a round trip exceeding 8 hours in the cockpit of a single-seat fighter. Second Lieutenant Harold Brown, preparing his Mustang for the mission, understood that fatigue posed as great a danger as German fighters. 8 hours of continuous vigilance, constant scanning for threats, maintaining formation position, managing fuel consumption, monitoring instruments, all while wearing full flight gear and oxygen equipment pushed human endurance to its limits. Add the adrenaline spikes of combat, the physical stress of high-G maneuvers, and the psychological weight of responsibility for bomber crews' lives, and the mission became an endurance trial as much as a combat operation. The Red Tails had lost pilots, of course. No fighter unit escaped the war unscathed. Second Lieutenant Robert Diaz died in February when his battle-damaged Mustang crashed during landing. First Lieutenant Clarence Dart disappeared over Austria in January, last seen diving through clouds pursuing German fighters threatening his assigned bombers. Captain Wendell Pruitt, one of the unit's most skilled pilots with multiple kills, died in a training accident in April. Each loss diminished the group's combat capability and tore at the bonds forged through shared hardship. Yet the loss rate among Red Tail pilots remained notably lower than casualty figures for fighter groups employing more aggressive, pursuit-oriented tactics. Statistics compiled by Air Force researchers after the war revealed that pilots who broke formation to pursue kills exposed themselves to dangers that disciplined formation flying minimized. The Red Tail's protective doctrine, while sometimes allowing German fighters to escape, kept American fighters within mutually supportive formations where wingmen could guard each other against surprise attacks. First Lieutenant Lee Archer, reflecting on this tactical approach in post-war interviews, emphasized that the Red Tails fought intelligently rather than recklessly. Many fighter pilots died chasing kills, losing situational awareness in the tunnel vision of pursuit, running low on fuel while far from friendly territory, or wandering into concentrations of enemy fighters while isolated from their squadrons. The Tuskegee pilots disciplined themselves to avoid these traps, understanding that surviving the war required suppressing the glory-seeking instincts that made fighter pilot culture so dangerous. The mission to Plitz demonstrated this discipline under extreme conditions. German fighters attacked the bomber formation repeatedly during the ingress, forcing the Red Tail escorts into continuous engagement. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading one fighter flight, found himself in turning fights with Mi-109s 3 separate times during the approach to target. Each time, he broke off engagement before being drawn far from the bombers, denying himself potential kills in favor of maintaining protective position. Staff Sergeant James Warren, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 under Red Tail protection during the Plitz mission, witnessed this restraint firsthand. He watched a Red Tail Mustang chase and Mi-109 away from the formation, saw the German fighter execute evasive maneuvers, and then observed the American pilot break off pursuit and return to station despite having a clear advantage. The decision puzzled Warren until he noticed 2 more German fighters approaching from the opposite direction, moving into the gap the pursuing Mustang would have created. The Red Tail pilot's restraint prevented exactly the tactical opening the German formation sought to exploit. This kind of disciplined patience required maturity uncommon among fighter pilots, whose ranks attracted young men drawn to combat aviation precisely because it offered opportunities for aggressive action and individual achievement. The Red Tails, carrying the additional burden of representing their race, developed institutional culture that valued mission success over personal glory. Captain Benjamin Davis had instituted this culture from the beginning, and it permeated every aspect of the unit's operations. Second Lieutenant Charles Bailey's experience illustrated the personal cost of this approach. During the Plitz mission, Bailey engaged an FW-190 attacking his assigned bomber element. The fight developed favorably, with Bailey achieving superior position for a killing shot. Before he could fire, he spotted another German fighter maneuvering to attack a different bomber in his protective zone. Bailey broke off his engagement to intercept the new threat, allowing his original target to escape. He drove off the second German fighter but scored no kill despite having opportunities against both opponents. His wingmen later congratulated him on prioritizing mission over personal score, but Bailey admitted the decision felt unsatisfying at a visceral level. April 25, 1945 brought news that Allied and Soviet forces had linked up at Torgau on the Elbe River, cutting Germany in half. The war in Europe was entering its final days. though German forces continued resisting with varying degrees of intensity. The 15th Air Force maintained operations, striking remaining industrial and transportation targets, ensuring that Germany could not mount any last-minute reversal of fortune. The 332nd Fighter Group flew escort missions during these final weeks, protecting bombers against the Luftwaffe that had become a shadow of its former strength. German fighter resistance had collapsed under the weight of years of attrition, fuel shortages, and the disintegration of command structures. Yet, even a dying Air Force remained dangerous, and the Red Tails maintained their protective vigilance. Captain Lee Archer flew his final combat mission on April 26, escorting bombers to Linz, Austria. The mission proceeded without enemy contact, German fighters no longer rising to challenge the formations crossing their territory. Archer circled above the bombers, scanning empty skies where months earlier he would have faced determined opposition. The absence of enemies felt anticlimactic after years of intense combat. Yet it signified something profound: victory, purchased through thousands of individual missions and countless acts of skill and courage. First Lieutenant Roscoe Brown's final mission came 3 days later, escorting B-24s to a target near Munich. Brown, whose Me-262 kill had brought him brief fame, completed the mission with the same disciplined focus he had brought to his first combat sortie. He maintained position above the bombers, managed his fuel carefully, scanned continuously for threats, and delivered his charges safely to target and home again. The routine nature of this final mission belied its significance. Brown had survived, he had protected American lives, and he had proven beyond any doubt that Negro pilots deserved their place in military aviation. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, arrived with mixed emotions for the Tuskegee Airmen. They had won their war, proven themselves in combat, and accumulated a record of achievement that should have silenced every critic. They had flown over 15,000 sorties, escorted thousands of bombers, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, and earned recognition as the finest escort pilots in the Mediterranean theater. Bomber crews requested them by name. German fighter pilots learned to fear their red-tailed aircraft. The statistics vindicated everything the program's supporters had claimed about Negro pilots' capabilities. Yet even as celebrations erupted across Europe, the Red Tails understood that their fight had only partly concluded. They had won the war against Germany, but the war against discrimination in their own country continued. They would return to an America where many states still enforced Jim Crow laws, where restaurants refused them service, where housing discrimination kept their families in substandard neighborhoods, where employment discrimination denied them opportunities despite their demonstrated excellence. Colonel Benjamin Davis, addressing his pilots as the group prepared to return to the United States, acknowledged this reality plainly. They had served with distinction, he told them, and they had earned respect through their achievements. But respect earned and respect granted were different things. The fight to integrate America's military and society would require the same discipline, courage, and persistence they had displayed in combat. Some of that fight would take years. Some of it would require sacrifice equal to anything they had faced over Europe. The statistics of their achievement told one story. According to Air Force records, the 332nd Fighter Group destroyed or damaged over 400 enemy aircraft, escorted over 3,000 bomber missions, and maintained a bomber loss rate significantly below the theater average. Individual pilots like Lee Archer, with 4 confirmed kills, and Roscoe Brown, with the Me-262 kill that made headlines, achieved ace or near-ace status. The unit earned numerous distinguished unit citations and hundreds of individual decorations for valor. But numbers alone could not capture what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished. They had broken a barrier more formidable than any German defensive line, the assumption, codified in military policy and embedded in American culture, that Negro citizens could not perform at the highest levels of technical and tactical competence. They had proven that excellence had no color, that courage knew no race, that discipline and skill could overcome prejudice. The bomber crews they protected never forgot. Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, the ball turret gunner who had flown missions under Red Tail Escort, later told his children and grandchildren about the colored pilots who circled his B-24 like protective angels, who stayed on station through flak and fighter attacks, who brought him home safely mission after mission. When his grandson asked why these pilots were so special, Johnson replied, "Because they fought 2 wars at once and they won both of them." The 332nd Fighter Group returned to the United States in October 1945, their Mustangs left behind in Italy, their combat service concluded. They returned as decorated veterans with combat records that should have guaranteed them respect and opportunity. Instead, they found an America largely unchanged by their sacrifices, still segregated, still discriminatory, still unwilling to grant Negro citizens full equality despite their military service. Major Lee Archer, returning to his home in New York, found employment doors closed despite his combat record and leadership experience. Companies hiring pilots for the emerging commercial aviation industry declined his applications without explanation. His race, which German fighter pilots had learned to fear, remained an insurmountable barrier in his own country's peacetime economy. Captain Roscoe Brown faced similar obstacles. His education, he held a degree from Springfield College and would later earn a doctorate combined with his combat experience, should have opened countless opportunities. Instead, he encountered the same discrimination that had existed before the war, as if his service and sacrifice meant nothing to institutions that viewed him through the lens of race rather than merit. Yet the Tuskegee Airmen's impact extended far beyond their individual career paths. Their combat record provided irrefutable evidence against theories of racial inferiority that had justified segregation in military and civilian life. When President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, mandating integration of the armed forces, he cited the distinguished service of Negro combat units, including explicitly the Tuskegee Airmen, as proof that segregation diminished military effectiveness without serving any valid purpose. The bomber crews they protected became advocates for integration and civil rights. White veterans who had flown under red-tail escorts spoke publicly about the skill and dedication of the Negro pilots who had saved their lives, testimony that carried weight precisely because it came from men with no ideological agenda beyond acknowledging the truth of their experience.